Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, we've had enough rain. The extremely wet start to 2026 means we've finally left last year's drought behind. More on that later, because we're going to start with land. It's seen as the answer to some of the big questions faced by society: cutting greenhouse gas emissions by generating renewable energy, building new homes to ease the housing crisis, making space for nature to halt the collapse of wildlife numbers, and farming to feed the nation. The problem is, land is a finite resource, so the debate over which land should be used for what purpose is becoming increasingly charged. While the government is hoping to take some of the heat out of the discussion and provide much-needed clarity, it's already consulted on a land use framework for England, and the final version is due to be published soon. Ahead of that, this week we're looking at those competing pressures on land. Dr. Stephen Emery is Senior Lecturer in the Sociology of Agriculture at Exeter University.
Well, we've seen lots of different new requirements, and particularly legally binding requirements, coming through from government, from international and national commitments. Primarily these relate to biodiversity commitments, so the requirement to enhance the conservation and management of protected sites across 30% of the land area of the country, and also the commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, much of which is being targeted at land use changes to achieve that target.
Now, this is where farmers get worried, because they think if we're going to reach all those targets, if we reckon that about 63% of England's land is agricultural at the moment, to meet the targets you could lose up to 9% to woodland or peatland restoration. So have farmers got a point that food security might take a hit here?
Yes, I think so, particularly if you look at the way that the land use framework, the government's land use framework, as currently proposed, has been worked out. What that consultation did was to very effectively model the land use changes required to meet obligations in terms of nature recovery and in terms of meeting climate targets. But what it didn't really do was, from the other side of the equation, look at our future prospects for food production. So we haven't really had anything within the land use framework which talked about the types of food that we want to produce, where we want to be producing that food, how we're going to be adapting to climate change and the increasing prevalence of extreme weather because of climate change. So what the land use framework effectively did was to say, what do we need to change away from agricultural production in order to meet our other obligations, without really looking seriously at how food production itself should change.
Presumably, though, once they release it, they could put that in, if you see what I mean.
We would hope so, yeah, and I imagine that is exactly the sort of thing that farmers are going to be looking for. If you combine the two highest categories of land use change that the government identified in the land use framework, it's approximately 9% of land is deemed to be going out of agricultural production altogether. Add on another 5%, which is still going to be farmed, but not primarily for farming, but primarily for environmental and climate reasons. That gives us 14% at a national level. And this brings us back to the point of regional disparities, because if we're protecting the highest value agricultural land, which the land use framework says it will do, that means that the actual changes of land away from agricultural production in some regions are going to be far higher than 14%. In other areas, far less. So we're going to have a real kind of bifurcated landscape going forward. And so I think what the government hopefully will be doing, or should be doing, in response to the feedback it's had on that consultation, is looking at how we actually manage resilience at the local and regional level, and thinking more in an integrated way about how food production, not just in terms of how much food we can we produce enough food, but the way we want to produce food, and how we want to focus on possibly more heterogeneity at the local level.
We're going to talk about solar farms later in the week. Building larger scale solar farms on agricultural land is something which is generating a lot of local protest in some areas. How might a land use framework help decide those sorts of issues?
It will really depend upon how it filters down to the local level. When we're talking at a national level, the figures for kind of house building, the figures for infrastructure development, which include things like solar and other renewables, they're less than 1% of land use change. So when you look at it nationally, it doesn't seem like it should be a large concern, and it's almost passed over. But obviously that does not mean that at the local level the impacts are much more significant and much more real. So I think what the government really needs to do is ensure that this national strategic overview is really combined with a local and regional focus as well, and particularly identifying where those areas are at most risk of particular land uses coming to dominate if left to their own devices.
Dr. Stephen Emery there from Exeter University. We'll have more on land use on the programme all this week, and we'll examine the details of the government's land use framework for England when the final version is published. Now, a search is on to find an award-winning dessert apple that one producer fears has almost disappeared from the culinary landscape. Mrs. Wilmot's Pippin was first grown in Derbyshire in the late 1800s. It won a Royal Horticultural Society Award of Merit for its flavour. Well, the apple is the one thing missing from Barry Lewis's Orchard of Heritage Varieties. BBC Radio Derby's Matt Weigold has been to meet him.
On the fairly squelchy Amber Valley vineyards, there are rows and rows of vines here in the gorgeous countryside near Wessington. But it's not grapes we're talking about today, it's the apples. Barry's got about 40 apple trees here and he's just finished planting another 200 up the road. But there's still one that's eluding Barry, and he's on the search for it.
So I'm looking for an apple called Mrs. Wilmot's Pippin. It's a Derbyshire variety, it originates in Langley Mill, and it was raised prior to 1900. Mrs. Wilmot herself died in 1900, and in 1917-18 her family submitted this apple to the RHS. The RHS thought it was a fabulous apple. It was entered into an award, a competition in 1921, and it won an award of merit for its flavour, etc., and it looked set to become a really sort of big thing. For whatever reason, it didn't become as big as hoped, but it became a very locally important apple, and it's one of only around half a dozen Derbyshire varieties, so it's really important that we kind of try and preserve it. So, kind of almost disappeared off the face of the earth, and by 1992 there was an effort by the Amber Valley Groundwork Trust to revive this apple's fortunes, and what they did was they managed to locate one in Codner, in a small orchard there, and they took cuttings of this and propagated it on and dispersed it a little bit sort of locally into the National Collection at Kent in Brogdale and to the nursery that was looking after it on a commercial level. But neither of those two places have it anymore for whatever reason. So I'm trying to track it down and try and track somebody down who knows where this tree might be and is certain it's a Mrs. Wilmot, so that we can take cuttings from it. And now is the time to do it. This time of year we can take cuttings and we can graft them and hopefully propagate them on and ensure that tree's survival, because it would be a missing flavour of Derbyshire basically. So it's really important and imperative that we try and find it.
What would you like to do with the apple? Would you like to make some products?
I would love to make some products from it. I mean, I'm sure it'll be if it's meant to be as as flavourful as it apparently was, according to the RHS. Then yes, it's going to be something quite special. So it's a dessert apple. It's quite large as well, and it's supposed to have this lovely flavour and nice acidity to it. So that straight away means it's probably good for cooking as much as it is for eating. So hopefully we can make some products and cider and things like that from it, and really ensure that it's got a future basically.
Well, it's a long shot, but if you do happen to know where there is a Mrs. Wilmot's Pippin, let us know. You can email us. We're farming.today@bbc.co.uk. After a marathon run of torrential rain, floods and grey skies to start 2026, the drought warnings from last autumn seem a world away. But back in October, the Environment Agency said that at least 100% of the average rainfall would be needed every month until the end of March for England to recover fully from the 2025 drought. So have we now had enough rain to replenish groundwater as well as rivers? Steve Turner from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology took me through the data, and it's a silver lining to all those rain clouds.
Between October and January, in England, we've had 127% of the average rainfall, more than average, and in February so far. So we've got data up until the 24th of February, just a few days ago, and England had almost 1.5 times of its average rainfall in February, just in those first 24 days. So as a whole, the country has broadly achieved and in many places exceeded the rainfall that was required to sort of mitigate the drought that we saw building up in 2025.
So we don't have to worry about drought now.
We shouldn't need to worry about drought in the immediate future. The wet weather that we saw in the winter has done exactly what we needed, really. And it has helped to, I guess, largely reset the hydrological system. We're never completely out of the woods. And if we had a very dry and hot spring, it could put pressure back on parts of the country, particularly in East Anglia, which is kind of the last region which is still in recovery from drought.
From what you're saying, it's not sort of completely over.
If we're in drought, and then as we're coming out of drought, we go into a status called recovery or recovery from drought, where perhaps it might be that the water levels or the groundwater levels, they're not quite back to normal where we might expect them for the time of year, but they're sort of going in the right direction. So we're still in that sort of, we're nearly there, we're getting there.
For the rest of the country then, have the groundwater levels recovered completely? Because that is one of the places we store water, if you like, in a natural store.
The general overall water situation now is a lot healthier, as I said. Rivers across the UK at the moment are almost all in the normal or above normal range for the time of year. A lot of the soils are saturated, and the reservoirs they're about average for the time of year, responding to all that rainfall that we've had. And then the groundwater, the aquifers which store water, particularly in areas like the southeast of England, the levels are pretty much normal or above normal in most regions. But again, the main exception is some areas in East Anglia and also in eastern Scotland. The groundwater levels were still below normal. But even there, they're below normal, but the levels are rising.
Stephen Turner. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Sarah Swadling, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.